All right, Josh, let's talk about your golf swing for a second. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of expose what I believe to be the timing element, um, the timing elements associated with your golf swing. And I don't want that to sound like a negative thing because, in my opinion, every golf swing has, some amount of timing in it, some more than others. And as players or instructors, the best we can do is to reduce um, some of that in golf swing to give us more consistency. So when I look at you from the face on view down the line, I'm going to talk about a couple things. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is your takeaway. And I can just wholeheartedly tell you, I am not a big fan at all of this um, hands in, club out fad that a lot of players and teachers alike are doing these days. And I think there's good intention behind it, but I've seen um, with this move two critical pieces that happen. Okay, so number one, in order to accommodate the hand path moving this far in, the trail arm or the right arm has to go into flexion prematurely. It has to. That's the only thing that allows the hands to go in. Okay? And when I see that, I generally see people pulling their right elbow or their right arm too far behind them. Okay? Now remember that trail arm needs to externally rotate so that the shaft can flatten. And the faster that you pull the right elbow behind you in this direction, the more internal that trail shoulder is going. Okay? So that's the first thing that I see. The second thing is this: in an effort to keep the club head outside the hands, the golfer generally just starts extending their left wrist and cupping their left wrist. Okay, and in your case, that's kind of exactly what happens when you get to the top here. Your wrist is in extension, and I'm not saying that you can't play good golf with your wrist in extension because there's a ton of guys on the PGA Tour that do it every week. But what I'm saying is the likelihood that you go from extension into flexion by this time right here is highly improbable. Okay? And the reason for it is because you're kind of a larger guy, you have a bigger upper body, not the longest backswing. So you're dealing with a short backswing or a shortish type of backswing. And, there's an old saying, you've got a long ways to go in a short time to get there. And you're just not, in my opinion, you're never going to get your left wrist out of extension from here to here. Okay? So you're working really hard on shallowing the club and you're trying to feel it in your trail arm. But the problem is that your trail arm is too narrow and it's too much in internal rotation. Now, internal or external rotation is something that most golfers have a very limited amount of. And it's not the deal breaker. It's not the be all and end all. Because what I would say is, at this point in the golf swing, I would say your left wrist is extended probably about 10 degrees. There's a pretty significant cup there in the left hand. And what I would say is that if your left wrist was in flexion at this point, that shaft would probably go from about right there to about right there. And then I think you'd be pretty happy with where you're seeing the club come down. Okay? So we know that when that wrist is extended, the hand path is going to tend to work in more of a downward fashion. Okay? And think about the reasons for that. You should associate an extended left wrist with generally an open club face position. Okay? Those two things kind of go hand in hand. So if you just take your club up to the top of the backswing and you cup your wrist, you'll see what the face does. And if you flex your wrist, you'll see what the face does. So we have the ability to change that face angle several degrees basically because of those wrist angles. And when the golfer feels that face open at the top, there's not necessarily any more incentive to flatten the shaft or lay the shaft down. Because what good does it do coming in nice and shallow and from the inside with a wide open club face? You're going to hit push blocks and push cuts and shanks. So the golfer, in order to rectify that face angle, will tend to steepen that shaft in transition to get that club to pitch more out in front of you so that you can kind of take it around the corner to the left and square the face that way. Okay? The problem with this is in your golf swing, when you start steepening the shaft slightly, you actually stand up and you start getting taller. So if we look at this face-on view of you here, you can see you start extending in the backswing here, getting tall, and then as you slide forward, you stay up, 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 up. Okay? Now, it's that point in the golf swing, from about the top of the backswing to the lead arm parallel to the ground, you should actually be lowering. Yes, you should be lowering. Your chest should be getting closer to the golf ball. Your pelvis should be moving further away from the golf ball. Your pelvis should be tilting. If I draw a line on your belt, it's here, and it should be tilting more this way. Here's a quick illustration on the right of what I'm talking about. Okay, so at the top of the backswing, which is the frame here on the left side of the right, the picture on the right, you can see a line, a green line or light blue line going through the golfer's pelvis, center of the pelvis. And what that is showing you is forward bend. So if I take you to an address position here, and I will draw the same line on your pelvis, let's call it right there. All right. Now, I can't exactly draw the line that corresponds to you, but I'm going to draw a 29-degree angle because that's what this golfer on the right is demonstrating. All right. And this is 3D, a 3D capture from a very, very, very good player of mine. You can see that his pelvis is tilted forward about 29 degrees. And his spine is tilted. And if I just draw this vertical line here, that's kind of what we've got going on over there on the right. His spine is tilted forward about 34 degrees. So I can't exactly draw the correct correlation, in 2D, but you get the idea. He's got 34 degrees of torso tilt forward, and he's got 29 degrees of pelvis bend forward, tilting toward the golf ball at the top of the backswing. Okay? Now, the frame to the right of that is very, very minuscule movement in transition. So if I take you to the top of your backswing, so that would be the picture on the left, and then the downswing, the hands are about right, actually probably closer to about right there. So not very far in the downswing. And what you can see that his pelvis is now tilted more forward. It goes from 29 degrees to about 35 degrees. And his torso also bends forward about 2 more degrees. So we've got a very short window where this occurs. It's basically from about the top of the backswing to just before lead arm parallel to the ground in the downswing. And that is your time frame and your interval where your pelvis needs to move back off the target line, and your chest needs to move closer to the golf ball while you create rotation of both the pelvis and the torso and the chest. So we're moving the tailbone back off the target line, we're moving the chest closer to the target line, and we are rotating both the hips and the shoulders open to the target line in that time frame. And that, in my opinion, is how we need to go about you shallowing the club. Okay, because when you put an outward force on this handle, the center mass of this club pitches in this direction because it's trying to line itself with the direction of that force. So right here at the top, if I drew a straight line down the club and you start putting a force on the club in this direction, well, that center of mass is going to try to align itself. If I draw that straight line this way, it's going to try to align itself with the direction of the force. So getting your hand path to move more outward is critical, okay? Because that's how we're going to shallow the shaft. It's not going to be through massive external rotation. We need to get that left arm closer to the stance line at this last parallel to the ground, okay? But we also have to do the things that I mentioned earlier to you. Okay, let's recap those things. I'm going to use a swing on the right, and this is the player that I showed you the 3D captures for before. So you can see how at address, his pressure is more toward his arches and more toward the balls of his feet, and he's actually got more forward bend of the spine at address. And that's an indication because his hands hang out a little bit from his body. You, on the other hand, look like you're kind of rocked back into your heels, standing a little bit more vertically. Okay? Your first move, the takeaway, is to drag the handle in and keep the club head out to this first parallel. Okay? The left wrist is extending rapidly at this time. Okay? In my opinion, the left arm does not need to be pulled this tight or this far in across the chest this early in the backswing. The only way that can happen is if the right arm pulls behind you and the right shoulder goes into internal rotation. If you look at the golfer on the right, you're going to see his hand path move in, but you're going to see it move in minuscule relative to yours. Okay, so if you look at that lead arm position, it's more on the toe line, less in across the chest, but his shoulders have turned just as much as yours have. The key note there is how the right elbow is staying down. You know, his elbow is pointed very much down to, towards his right thigh, so to speak, whereas your elbow is pointing more like at your right hip socket. The club head slightly inside the hands. Face is still, relatively square. And then as we progress upwards, shaft flattens right there, where yours gets a little bit steeper. And the shaft is definitely more vertical, and that's simply due to all of the extension in your left wrist. So if you look at how flat this golfer's, left hand is here on the right, his wrist is actually, at this point, because I've measured his 3D wrist angles as well, barely in extension at this point. So that should tell you the difference between yours and his. I would say he's probably 1 or 2 degrees extended at this point. So without measuring you, I would say you're probably in the 12 to 15 degree extended ballpark. All right? And then onto the top, this is the point where you need to understand the lowering piece. And, I'm trying to do the best I can here in a 2D video and illustrate some of these things for you. But if I just draw a line on the top of your head and then draw a line on the top of his head, you're going to see on the way down that you stay tall through the ball. And that's not what good players do. Good players lower. Good players squat. They lower into the ground. Their pelvis bends forward. Their chest gets closer to the golf ball, and they rotate. So here's him at impact versus where you're at impact. You can see much more flexion in the right knee. You can see much more bend in the right right arm. And you can see the pelvis more open and the chest, probably pretty close to similar positions. But That's the direction we need to go with your golf swing, and hopefully you understand how to get there. So it starts with your takeaway. Once you put all the extension in there and you cup that wrist and you stand that shaft up and you pull that right arm behind you, it's very hard to flatten the shaft from there. But plus, there is no incentive to flatten the shaft because of how open you have the club face. So that club face condition has to change for you to be able to move your hands out, move your chest closer to the ball, move your tailbone further back off the target line, like you see this golfer doing on the right. And then you can really turn and rotate and take this thing around the corner. So look at how stable his club face is versus how quickly yours is rotating and flipping around the corner. You can see his for a very long period of time. All right, hope this video helps you. Good luck in PGA Tour Canada Q School, and shoot me an email if you have any questions.